Still on The Awakening, Season 1, Episode 2. Why was everyone else given the Rulebook? Hi, friend. Come on in. I'm so glad you came back. The kettle is on. Your chair is waiting, and there is always room for you at this table. Take a breath. Let your shoulders come down. You do not have to rush here. You do not have to perform here. You do not have to prove your worth. You are welcomed just as you are. Last time we sat together, we talked about the moment I realized I was never broken. That realization changed the way I saw my life. It changed the way I looked at the little girl under the stairs. It changed the way I understood the woman I had become. And maybe it caused you to look at your own life differently too. But after an awakening like that, another question often rises. A question I carried for years. If I was never broken, why did life seem so natural to everyone else? Why did people seem to understand things I could not quite grasp? Why did everyone else appear to know the rules? And why did I always feel like mine had been left out the box? That is what I want us to talk about today. Not because I have every answer, but because I know what it feels like to spend years believing everyone else was given the rule book, and yours somehow got lost. So settle in, warm your hands around your cup, put your chair a little closer. Let's begin. The big question: have you ever been in a conversation where everyone suddenly laughed, but you were not quite sure why? So you smiled too. Maybe you even laughed, not because you understood the joke, but because you did not want anyone to notice that you did not. Have you ever walked into a room and everyone seemed to know exactly what to do, where to stand, who to greet first, when to speak, when to stop speaking, how long to stay, when it was acceptable to leave? And there you were, watching, waiting, trying to pick up cues. Maybe you have sat in a meeting and everyone seemed to understand what was expected, even though no one had actually explained it. Maybe someone just said, just use common sense. And you quietly wondered, common to who? For years, I believe there was a rule book for life, a book explaining friendships, workplace, relationships, social gatherings, and all the unwritten expectations people seem to understand. I imagined everyone else had received their copy, and somehow mine had never arrived. There was the education people taught out loud: reading, writing, mathematics, how to complete an assignment, how to arrive on time, how to do the work. And then there was another education, an invisible curriculum, that lessons nobody formally taught because everyone assumed you already knew them. How to tell when someone was joking, how to recognize when a person wanted the conversation to end, how to understand when "that's interesting" did not actually mean they found it interesting, how to know when someone was being kind and when they were being polite, how to tell when a rule was really a rule and when people expected you to bend it. I could learn the instructions that were written down. It was the instructions no one wrote that left me confused. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever thought, there must be something everyone else knows that no one remembered to tell me? If you have, you're not the only one. When I look back at my childhood, I can see how early I began watching. I watched the other children, how they joined groups, how they seemed to know who belonged with whom, how they made friends without appearing to study the process. I noticed how quickly they understood one another, and I remembered wondering how they knew. School was not only about learning what was on the board. For me, it was also about learning the room, who was safe, who might laugh, what answers the teacher wanted, not only the answers she asked for. When it was acceptable to ask another question, and when another question would make people impatient. I was not simply learning the lesson, I was learning how to exist inside the lesson. Have you ever been in a classroom, a workplace, or even a family where you were trying to understand more than anyone realized? You are not only listening to the words, you are listening for what words might mean. You are watching faces, reading the room, preparing for what might happen next. The kind of learning is exhaustion, especially when no one knows you are doing it. As I grew older, the room changed, but the watching continued. New jobs came with written job descriptions, but every workplace also had written expectations. Who really made the decisions? Who could speak freely? Who had to be careful? Which rules matter? Which rules were ignored? What people meant when they said, "We're like a family here." I could understand the work. I knew how to lead. I knew how to solve problems. I knew how to take responsibility. But sometimes the work was not the hardest part. The hardest part was trying to understand the people around the work. Maybe you know that feeling. You start a new position and everyone tells you what your responsibilities are. But no one tells you how the culture really works. No one tells you which questions are welcomed and which questions make people uncomfortable. No one tells you that honesty is encouraged until your honesty challenges the wrong person. No one tells you that be yourself sometimes means be the version of yourself that makes us comfortable. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever followed the instructions only to discover there were other instructions that no one had said out loud? Social gatherings could feel the same way. I could attend, I could smile, I could participate, I could talk, but afterwards, I might replay the entire evening. Did I say too much? Did I misunderstand something? Was the person upset with me? Why did their expression change? Should I have stayed longer? Did I leave too soon? Was I too quiet? Was I too direct? Did I miss something? The gathering might be over for everyone else, but in my mind, it was still going. I would continue the conversation long after everyone had gone home. Have you ever driven from somewhere and replayed what you said? Maybe you changed your answer in your mind. Maybe you suddenly understood a joke 20 minutes later. Maybe you remembered someone's expression and wondered what it meant. Maybe the other people had already forgotten the conversation, but you were still carrying it. Even church, a place where I believe I should feel at home, could sometimes leave me wondering. People appear to know how to connect, how to speak the language, how to express their faith in ways others recognize. And I loved God. My faith carried me. But there were times when I still felt like I was standing at the edge of the room, present, but not fully understood, faithful, but still trying to figure out where I fit. Maybe you have felt like that, an outsider, in a place where you believed everyone should belong. That kind of loneliness can be difficult to explain because people may see you in the room and assume you feel included, but being present and belonging are not always the same thing. Looking back now, I realize I was doing more than watching people. I was learning a language, not Spanish, not French, not a language taught in a classroom. I was learning the language of people. I studied faces, trying to understand what was not being said. I listened to tone, trying to determine whether someone was disappointed, angry, tired, or simply distracted. I watched laughter, trying to understand when something was funny and when laughter was being used to cover discomfort. I listened for sarcasm. I listened for hidden meanings. I listened for the difference between yes and a yes that really meant no. I paid attention to expectations that no one explained. And when I got something wrong, I stored it away. I remembered the reactions. I adjusted. I tried not to make the same mistake again. Little by little, I built my own translation guide. That is one of the ways masking begins. You learn what's received approval. You learn what creates confusion. You learn what makes others comfortable. And then, without realizing it, you begin translating yourself before anyone else has the chance to misunderstand you. You soften your words. You change your expressions. You rehearse your response. You hide your discomfort. You smile when you are overwhelmed. You say, "I'm fine." Because explaining the truth would require more energy than you have left. I spent years blaming myself for not speaking a language no one realized I was learning. Let me say that again. I was not failing at life. I was learning to read a language no one knew I was learning. Maybe you are neurodivergent, and those words feel familiar. But you do not have to be neurodivergent to understand what it means to translate the world. Maybe you grew up in a family where no one said, "I love you." So you learned to translate food on the table, rides to school, and bills being paid as love. Maybe you grew up around anger. You learned to translate footsteps, a door closing, the way someone places keys on the counter. You could tell what kind of evening it would be before a word was spoken. Maybe you entered a workplace where the rules changed depending on who was involved. Maybe you were part of a relationship where you never knew where you stood. Maybe you became whoever other people needed you to be because it felt safer than allowing them to see the real you. Perhaps you have been translating too, translating silence, translating rejection, translating expectations, translating love, translating yourself, and perhaps you are tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, the kind that comes from spending years trying to understand a world that rarely slowed down long enough to understand you. Later in life, I began to learn about neurodivergence. At first, it was information, words, experiences, descriptions. But then something began to happen. I started recognizing myself. I would read something and stop. I would hear something, describe an experience, and think, wait, that sounds familiar. Then another piece connected, and another. Things I had carried for years began finding language. The watching, the exhaustion, the replaying of conversations, the feeling that everyone else understood something I did not, the need for quiet, the way the world would sometimes feel too loud, too fast, too demanding. My life began to make sense in a way it never had before. Not because every question was answered, but because I finally understood there was a reason I experienced the world the way I did. I sat with that understanding, and memories began returning. The little girl under the stairs, the classrooms, the social gatherings, the workplaces, the rooms where I tried so hard to appear as though I understood. I looked back at all the versions of myself that I had judged, and for the first time, I saw them with compassion. I did not cry because I had a name. I cried because I finally stopped blaming myself. Can you imagine what it feels like to spend years believing you are the problem and then discover you are trying to navigate life without the understanding you needed? There was relief, but there was also grief. Grief for the years I misunderstood myself. Grief for the times I called myself difficult. Grief for the moments I thought if I would just try harder, when trying harder was already what I had been doing. But grief was not the end. Grace met me there. Grace allowed me to look back without condemning myself. Grace reminded me I had done the best I could with the understanding I had. Grace helped me see that I was not weak. I was not lazy. I was not failing. I was learning, adapting, surviving, leading, living, and doing much of it without the language that would have helped me understand why. Discovering I was neurodivergent did not change who I was. It changed the story I had been telling myself about who I was, and that changed everything. Can I ask everyone around the table something? Take a moment before you answer. You do not have to say it out loud. Just let the question sit beside you. When was the first time you remembered feeling different? Where were you? How old were you? Who was in the room? What happened? And what did you begin believing about yourself because of that moment? Maybe your memory came quickly. Maybe you saw a classroom, a playground, a family dinner, a church, a workplace. Maybe you remembered being left out. Maybe you remembered being corrected for something you did not understand. Maybe someone called you strange, too quiet, too loud, too sensitive, too serious, too much. Maybe no one said anything at all. Maybe you simply looked around and realized you did not experience the moment the way everyone else seemed to. Now, let me ask you another question. What if that moment did not prove there was something wrong with you? What if it only proved you needed understanding? What if the version of you in that memory does not need criticism from you today? What if they need compassion? Picture that younger version of yourself. You do not have to explain everything to them. You do not have to solve their entire life. Simply sit beside them and say, "You are not failing. You are learning a language no one knew you were learning." Sometimes healing begins when the person we are today finally becomes gentle with the person we used to be. Can I share something that has been on my heart? Have you wondered why God created forests instead of tree farms? Walk through a forest. No two trees are exactly alike. Some stand tall, some bend, some grow close together, some grow apart. Some have wide branches. Some have deep roots hidden beneath the ground. Some bloom early. Others appear lifeless for a season until the right time comes. Yet together, they create something beautiful. God did not create one tree and repeated endlessly. Creation is filled with difference, texture, color, sound, pattern, rhythm. Maybe God has always delighted in diversity more than uniformity. Psalms 139 says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I had read those words before, but after my awakening, I heard them differently. It does not say, I will be wonderfully made once I learn to act like everyone else. It does not say, I will be wonderfully made when everyone understands me. It says, I am already, right now, made with intention, known completely. The God who created me did not need me to become a copy in order to call me his creation. And he does not need you to become a copy either. Difference does not cancel design. Struggle does not erase purpose. Being misunderstood by people does not mean you are unknown to God. Well, friend, our time together is almost over. Before you leave the table today, let's share our still mind moment. Take a slow breath. Now finish this sentence. Today I remember my blank is still mine. Maybe today you remember you were seeing the world is still yours. Your curiosity is still yours. Your voice is still yours. Your faith is still yours. Your ability to begin again is still yours. Or maybe you remembered that being different never made you less. Hold on to your answer. Write it down. Place it somewhere you can see it. Share it in the comments if you feel led. There may be someone else sitting at this table who needs the words you are willing to share. Before we close, I would like to offer a simple prayer. Lord, for the person listening today who has spent years believing they were the only one, remind them that they are fully known, fully loved, and never alone. Help them look at their story with grace. Help them realize the blame they have carried. Give them courage to embrace the person you created them to be. And when the world feels difficult to understand, remind them that they are always understood by you. Amen. Next Tuesday, I will talk about something that can happen when you spend years studying the Rulebook and translating the world. You become very good at pretending you understand, pretending you are comfortable, pretending you are not tired, pretending you are fine. But what happens when you pretending begins to cost you yourself? We will talk about that next time. Until then, be gentle with yourself. Make room for compassion. And remember, you are not failing at life. You are trying to read a language no one knew you were learning. You are not broken. You were designed. Thank you for coming to my table today. There is always a chair waiting for you. I'll see you next Tuesday.